we'll talk about today, just in this first session, we've got about 45 minutes or so to cover these topics. I'm going to give a quick overview of third stage, as well as an introduction to myself, a little bit about my background. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about digital transformation utopia and this grand vision that many organizations have, and rightfully so, for what they want their organizations to be and how they want their transformations to evolve over time. And then we'll talk about some of those transformation challenges that organizations face getting to that utopia state. And then finally, the meat of the presentation, we'll get to trends to consider in the 2020s, things that you should be aware of and watching for, and the types of technologies and things that you should be aware of as you're planning your digital strategy and roadmap for the coming years. So just to start, though, a bit about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. We're an independent transformation consulting firm. So we help clients throughout the world with their transformation journeys. We help with software evaluation and selection. We help with implementation, project management, organizational change management, which is where I grew up, or the space that I came up in the world of consulting. And we also do quite a bit of expert witness work. So when we talk about some of the things we're going to talk about later related to case studies and lessons learned from failure, a lot of that background and knowledge comes from our experience as expert witnesses. So that's a bit about the services we provide at a high level. And I think that the two main things to note about our company are that we're independent and 100% technology agnostic, so we're not aligned with any software vendors or system integrators. Our job is to help clients, regardless of the type of technology, through their transformation journeys. And the other thing that's always worth pointing out is we tend to take a business first approach to consulting. So we don't lead with technology. We don't try to force technology where it doesn't belong or where it doesn't fit. We typically will start with your business needs or the client's business needs and define a strategy and roadmap from there. We have offices throughout the world. We're based in the United States. That's where Kyler and I are today. We also have offices in London as well as Brisbane, Australia. And you're going to hear from some of our team in both of those locations as well. So regardless of where in the world you are, or if you've got international operations, we have the team to support you in your transformations. I mentioned a little bit about our services already, but the main things we do, as I mentioned, are software evaluation and selection, and the whole digital strategy and roadmap process, as well as the implementation, program management, change management, and business process improvement as well. So the name Third Stage, it's a rocket launch analogy, which alludes to the first two stages of a rocket would typically be the boosters that would get a rocket into space. And then you'd have a third stage launch that would get the rocket up to its ultimate height and speed. And I always thought that was a good analogy for transformations because they're so hard to overcome, the gravity and inertia. And most companies tend to struggle or fail in their initiatives as a result of that. So our goal as an organization, and even in the content we're sharing here today, is how do we help you realize that third stage of success? How do we help you get past those first two stages that most organizations get stuck in? And what are those best practices and things you can be doing better to reach that third stage of success? So that'll be, a key theme that you'll hear throughout the 3 days, certainly today's opening sessions, as well as the next 2 days as well. What can we be doing? What are those best practices and lessons we can be taking to our teams and our organizations to make sure we reach that third stage of success? And the other background point of the name Third Stage, if any of you are classic rock buffs like I am, it also comes from the name of Boston's third album, the band from the late 70s, early 80s. Their third album was called Third Stage, and that's actually where I really got the idea for the name. But they themselves named it after a rocket launch analogy, and I stole the idea from them. So in full transparency, that's where the name originated. But if you're a classic rock fan, hopefully you can appreciate that reference as well. Some of the clients we've worked with over the years are quite a variety of different organizations: manufacturing, distribution, healthcare, financial services, nonprofits, retail, all sorts of different types of organizations. Oil and gas, that's another area we're doing quite a bit of work in lately, as well as construction. So a lot of different industries. I would also consider us industry agnostic in addition to being technology agnostic. That's a big differentiator for us, is that breadth of background and experience in helping a variety of clients through their transformations. And we also work with clients of all different sizes. We have some clients that are 5 to 10 million in annual revenue, but we have some clients that are 25 to 30 billion in annual revenue. Most clients are somewhere in between, but we pride ourselves on being able to scale our service offering and our support up or down, depending on the size of the organization and just what the needs and competencies are for that particular organization. So with that being said, I want to jump right into the content here. And like I said, if any point while I'm talking, I'm going to keep watching the chat box here, and Kyler may interrupt me at any point and ask questions that come in on your behalf. And if you're listening, we're actually multi-streaming this to a couple different platforms. If anyone's watching this on LinkedIn or YouTube, we'll keep an eye on that as well to see any comments or questions you might have there. And if you are watching on LinkedIn or YouTube, we encourage you or invite you to come over to Crowdcast, where a majority of the people are, but certainly welcome you to watch whatever platform you prefer. And we're also streaming to Facebook as well. So I want to jump into this whole concept of digital transformation utopia. And this is, I think a problem and opportunity at the same time. And I'll describe what I mean by that here before we get into sort of the big trends and the big things to be aware of and thinking about as you plan your transformation journey for the next several years. And when we look at digital transformation in general and what it is, I'm actually going to talk in a session later today. There's another session I'll be talking more about unpacking what digital transformation is and how to make it successful, and sort of that executive level summary of what it takes to make a transformation successful. But in the meantime, just to start, I want to talk a little bit about what are some of those big technologies, those common technologies that are out there that can drive or enable a digital transformation. For some organizations, they think of digital transformation as, I'm just going to go find a back office ERP system and replace my financial and inventory management system. That's perfectly fine. But there's also organizations that might look at it from a CRM or sales perspective, or an HCM and human capital perspective. But in addition to those, call it the more typical enterprise technologies, you also have a number of emerging technologies and more cutting edge technologies that are in some cases being integrated into ERP and CRM and HCM and supply chain management technologies and things of that nature. But they're also standalone technologies as well, best of breed types of solutions that are addressing many of these types of technologies that you see listed here. And actually later today, I think 2 sessions from now, Stuart Robb from our UK office, who actually heads up our UK office, is going to talk more about some of these emerging technologies in a lot more detail. So I'm not going to dive into what blockchain is, or how cybersecurity can be applied to your initiative, although we have another session on cybersecurity that'll be happening tomorrow. But instead, I wanted to just highlight the fact that there's a lot of technology out there, a lot of opportunities to use technology to enable improvements, to automate your business, to drive efficiency. And when you look at these options, there's certainly a lot of upside opportunity, but it's also can be very overwhelming, and it can be hard to make a decision of what it is we should do, what's right for our organization, what do we really need, how mature are these technologies really relative to what we want or need and what our risk profile is. And so the whole plethora of options out there can make it opportunistic, and it's exciting, and there's a lot of great visionary types of things we can be doing in our transformation. But at the same time, it can be overwhelming, and the gap or the magnitude of change to get to these states of utopia, as I called it earlier, can be very difficult, and that magnitude of change can be very significant. So that's one of the main challenges that organizations oftentimes face is trying to navigate all of those different options. And when we think about what are those pitfalls, what are those roadblocks or obstacles that prevent us from getting to that utopia? We look at things like artificial intelligence and all the opportunities that could bring to our organization. That's a great vision to set, but then we have to back up and look at where are we today, and what is that gap, and how do we close that gap? And that's where a lot of organizations struggle. The technology is there in many cases, although in many cases, as we'll talk throughout these sessions, in many cases, the technology is not quite mature, or mature enough for some organizations, but the opportunity is there. The technology is out there, and there's a lot of different options. And so the challenges that organizations often face are things like the flawed perception that transformation is going to be easy, cheap, and fast. With emerging new technologies, exciting technologies, improved technologies, comes an unrealistic expectation that is somehow going to be a silver bullet to our organization. And therefore, it must be easy, cheap, and fast to implement if it's going to be a silver bullet for our organization. And that's a flawed assumption that a lot of organizations get trapped in. And so we have to figure out, how can we add that dose of reality and have our eyes wide open going into our transformation. Organizations more often than not underestimate the magnitude of risk and change. Not only the risk and change that's required to get to that state of utopia or that long-term vision that they're aiming for, but their own tolerance for risk. That's one of the first things we do in working with organizations is really assessing what is the risk profile, what's the risk tolerance of this organization, and what's the right roadmap and the right future state vision for this organization based on who they are and who they're trying to become. For example, we work with a lot of family-owned businesses, second or third generation family-owned businesses that are, relatively risk adverse. They don't, they have a lot to learn or a lot to lose, I should say, in terms of taking on risk. There's obviously family dynamics involved and other organizational, personal dynamics. And so there tends to be a sort of risk aversion that comes along with that. And that's perfectly fine. That's not a right or wrong assessment, but it's a matter of saying, okay, based on the cultural profile of this organization, what is the right roadmap for them? And that's probably going to look a lot different than a startup that is swinging for the fences, that can take on a huge amount of risk and feel perfectly comfortable with it. So that's really understanding and assessing the magnitude of risk and change and being realistic about it is very important. And then the failure to address the human component of transformation is another big pitfall that we see. And that's a common theme you're going to hear throughout the entire conference, especially when I'm speaking, just because I tend to think about things from a change management first perspective. And then there's also the organizational misalignment component of things. More often than not, organizations struggle or fail in their implementations, not because of anything that's necessarily wrong with the technology or even with the project management or the way the project's being run. Oftentimes it's a deeper, more foundational, fundamental problem related to alignment or lack thereof. And so organizations, they can't agree at the top, for example, at the top levels of the organization, they can't agree on who they are and what they want to be when they grow up, and they haven't set a clear vision for that going into a transformation. Those headwinds and the friction that creates is going to undermine the potential success of the project. So those are some of the things to be aware of or thinking about, and those are some of the common challenges that prevent organizations from reaching that state of utopia. So what I want to talk about now are, how do we navigate some of those common transformation challenges in the 2020s and beyond? As we think about our digital strategy roadmap and overall plan for the coming years, what are those challenges we face and how do we overcome them? And then once we get past this section, then I want to dive more into some of the trends to be aware of and some of the trends to be thinking about or watching for in the industry. So first is to understand transformation success versus failure. I mean, I'm not going to read all of these bullets here, and it may be a bit hard to read depending on how you're consuming this content right now. But I'll summarize to say that a lot of the issues caused by failure are related more to people and processes rather than technology itself. Technology certainly can create challenges, especially in today's day and age where the technology is changing so quickly that in some cases it's not as mature as it needs to be for some organizations. But largely the problems that organizations face and the failure points that they face are related to people and processes. And so we have to think about, what are those common human and business process issues that organizations face and how can we overcome them? And we're actually going to talk a lot more about this when Marcus Harris speaks later today. Marcus from Taft Law, he's going to be talking about lessons from failure. So I'll let him dive into this in a bit more detail, but I want to sort of scratch the surface or give you a preview of some of the themes that you'll be hearing when he speaks later today. But that's the key, is that the failure points are often related to people and processes. In some cases, it's related to project management and the overall governance and controls. And then when we look at the projects that succeed, that's more often than not going to be a bit more related to people and processes as well. So when you look at why do the successful projects that we've worked with, how does that compare to the failures or the challenge projects that hire us to come clean up their projects? What's the difference? And you can oftentimes point that or point to some of the people and process issues. The other big failure points, if I have whenever someone asks me to really narrow it down a bit more, if I have to take this slide and say, give me one or two bullet points of why projects fail or succeed, and let's get to the root cause of what it is. A lot of these things listed here on this slide are symptoms of even deeper root causes, which, if I had to summarize that, would be one of the things I mentioned before, which is alignment, which is if we're not aligned as an organization, as a team, we don't have a clear vision of where we're headed and what this transformation means to us and how it's going to support our business processes and our strategy going forward, then it's going to be very difficult to succeed. So alignment or lack thereof is a root cause of success and failure. And then the second thing I would say to summarize the root cause of success or failure is the level of realistic expectations. So when you look at organizations that have unrealistic expectations, oftentimes that's a root cause that leads to a lot of the things you see in red over here on the left side of your screen. So for example, if I go into a project and I think it's going to take me 12 months to go through an entire implementation and say $1 million or whatever it is, I draw a line in the sand, I get board approval, everyone's aligned on this 12-month, $1 million sort of parameter. But then I get into the project and quickly realize, oops, I need a lot more time than 12 months and I need a lot more money than $1 million if I'm going to do this right. But oftentimes we've already gotten the approval, it is what it is, and now we've got to work within those confines. And so we end up backing into an unrealistic number, which entails oftentimes cutting things that shouldn't be cut. So we cut corners, we skimp, we cut out change management, we cut that extra cycle or two out of our testing process, whatever the case may be. And it leads us into the snowball effect that then leads to a lot of these symptoms you see on this slide. So if I had to summarize two things to do to be successful or to avoid failure, it would be to make sure that you're aligned as an organization, you take the time up front to get that alignment. And we're going to talk more about that in some of the other sessions here this week. And then the second thing is to make sure you have realistic expectations and recognize that when you get proposals from software vendors and system integrators, you're being sold. You're not being set realistic expectations you are being sold to. So you have to take it with a grain of salt and assume that the assumptions are overly optimistic, and we've got to figure out how to make this a little bit more realistic for us as an organization. And so, the other part of this too is as we think about how do we get to that utopia, how do we navigate some of these trends in the industry, how do we get, from where we are today and where, that long-term future state is. And maybe we're thinking 5 or 7 or 10 years out, and that's okay. We're not going to get there overnight, but we can at least set a vision or a path of how we're going to get there. One of the key first steps is to make sure that we have a clear strategy defined up front. So a clear digital strategy and roadmap and a clear understanding of what it is we need to accomplish. And when we look at digital strategies and roadmaps for our clients, there's really 6 major buckets or work streams that we focus on. And you can see listed on the left side of the screen here. Business process management is the first one, where we look at, what are our business processes today? What do we want them to look like in the future? And this is a really important one that gets back to that whole alignment discussion. We need to be aligned on what we want our operations to be going forward. It's a very flawed and dangerous assumption to assume that the technology is somehow going to answer that question for you or help you define that, because it's not. It may help you define how a screen is going to look or how a little, micro workflow is going to work within, transactions, but it's not going to answer the big picture questions for you of how your processes should flow, what they should look like. And you really need to have that alignment and definition before you start spending money on system integrators and expensive consultants and buying software that you're not ready for, that sort of thing. So business process management is the first workflow or work stream. And then organizational change management, which I will always argue is the most important one, making sure that you assess the organization and have a clear change strategy and plan early in your transformation roadmap. If there's one critical path thing that's likely to slow down your project, it's change management. So you can never start change management too early. And I rarely use absolutes, but this is a case where I will say you can never start it too early. I've yet to meet anyone, even on our own consulting teams, who said, we started change management too early. We should have waited a while before we got into change management. It's usually quite the opposite. People feel like they should have started sooner. And even when we're involved in a change initiative for a client or a change management initiative, you still constantly have that feeling of we could have done a little bit more. If we had that extra time, that extra focus on change management, that only would have helped us. So I think having that focus early as possible is important. And then you have the enterprise application or technology piece, which is that third work stream, which is where how do we navigate all these different options we have in the market and find the technology that's best for us? Solution architecture, how do we tie these different technologies together? Even if we're implementing a core ERP system that presumably will handle most of our business functions, how do we tie that to other third-party legacy systems or other bolt-ons that we might need? That solution architecture piece is very important. And then business intelligence and analytics. How do we use data to report and provide information that we can do to make better decisions and better understand the situation or the operational situation that we're in, and really leveraging that data from our systems to do that. And then finally, project quality assurance. That's something that starts during the strategy phase and should continue all the way through your transformation, which is just making sure you've got the right governance and controls in place, the right risk mitigation factors, that sort of thing. So this whole section here is really intended to think about, we've got this future state, we've got this vision of all these cool technologies out there that we could be deploying in our organization. There's a big gap from where we are today to getting to that future state. How do we close that gap? How do we navigate that whole journey and get past those pitfalls, mitigate the risk, all that good stuff? And that's really what I intended to focus on here first, before getting back to the future state. What are some of those trends? What are some of those cool technologies and things that we should be thinking about as we are transforming our organizations? So what I want to do here, and again, I'm starting to dip into or setting the stage or preview what Stuart Robb is going to talk about here. I believe it's in about an hour and a half. He'll be going on to talk about some of the emerging technologies in the technology space. And what I want to do, though, is just touch on a few themes or common things that we are seeing, and ERP vendors and enterprise technology vendors are focused on. So I want to touch on a few of those here today, just to give you some sense of what are some of the things we should be thinking about as we think about that future state of Utopia. We're going to talk throughout the rest of the day and throughout the rest of the week of how do we get there? What are the steps we need to do to get to that future state? But for now, I want to talk about that vision, that long-term vision of what the different types of technologies are out there, and what some of the trends are that we're seeing in the marketplace right now. So first is the acceleration of cloud adoption. This has been a trend that's been happening for several years now, close to a decade. There were software vendors in the early 2000s that were first coming onto the scene with sort of cloud only offerings. So you had systems or vendors like NetSuite, Salesforce, et cetera, that really started and built their whole system in the cloud. So they were always in the cloud to begin with. So that's one of the things is that the cloud adoption that is something we're seeing more of. Software vendors that are native in the cloud, as well as now traditionally on-premise systems. Even the on-premise vendors are moving to the cloud. They're moving their on-premise systems to the cloud as we speak. Many of the vendors are moving in that direction, and what's important to recognize, though, is that so many of the vendors are not quite there yet in terms of maturity in moving their products to the cloud. So while vendors like NetSuite and Salesforce, for example, they grew up in the cloud, they've always been in the cloud, their products are relatively mature. They may or may not be a good fit for your organization or your needs, but the product itself is mature in the cloud because they've always been there, for a good 20 years or so. Now, when you look at software vendors like SAP and Oracle, Microsoft, some of the big ERP enterprise-wide software providers that are just now migrating their on-premise systems to the cloud, those are the vendors that are not quite as mature as others. And that's where you really have to look at the maturity of the product and the capabilities and the functions to make sure that you know exactly what you're getting and what you're not getting, because there's a lot of gaps and a lot of holes in these systems as they're migrating to the cloud. So despite the fact that there's a lack of maturity in many cases for a lot of these software vendors, that cloud adoption rate is accelerating. Software vendors are aggressively moving to the cloud quickly, whether any of us like it or not. That's where software vendors are headed for the most part. And so I think the key there is to recognize, some of the things that software vendors don't necessarily want you to know, and they're not necessarily going to come out and say it, but their products aren't mature in many cases. There's a lot of capabilities missing. The other thing, if you want to be frank and brutally honest, is that cloud solutions oftentimes are better for vendors than they are for customers because they make more money. It's constant, steady, subscription-based revenue. And vendors hate when I say this, and I apologize to any of the vendors that are on the session today or listening in, but cloud solutions typically cost more in the long term than on-premise. Even when you factor in infrastructure costs and the cost of maintenance, the reality is once you get to that year 5 or 7, you tend to see a increase in cost longer term, just because that annual subscription cost isn't going away. At least with on-prem, you have that big upfront capital cost, and then you have that small ongoing maintenance fee. But it's a lot like leasing versus buying a car. At some point, you pay it off, and you end up with the technology, and you own it for better or for worse. So I think that's a big thing to be aware of, is that you're probably going to spend more in a cloud environment. It may be a better answer for you. It may give you more flexibility. It may be a better fit. It's going to keep you on the cutting edge of R&D and some of the software and technological capabilities. And that's a whole nother story on the benefit side. But on the cost side, that's something to be aware of. So that cloud adoption is increasing largely because the vendors want it to be increasing. And there certainly is advantages, certainly to organizations that are adopting to the cloud as well. And the other thing I'll note too about cloud adoption is that the cloud adoption rate has actually accelerated pretty dramatically in this COVID world. So just in the last 12 months or so, as organizations have been forced to deal with semi-remote workforces or partially remote hybrid workforces, as they've had to deal with global disparate supply chains, as they've had to deal with some of these more complex business processes and things that have been a byproduct of the COVID world, that has really fast-tracked cloud adoption as well. And it's really exposed organizations that are on premise. It's really exposed some of the weaknesses of that sort of infrastructure, because it's a lot more difficult to manage a remote workforce when you have an on-premise system and people are trying to access the system remotely. So that's really fast-tracked the cloud adoption rate as well. And I think at some point, the word cloud and cloud adoption may be a moot point, because I think eventually will just be where technology is, and that it just is the preferred backbone for many organizations going forward, most likely. Another trend to be thinking about here is this whole concept of machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's a fascinating buzzword. It's been around for quite some time, but it's just now starting to seep into call it the mainstream. And when I say mainstream, I mean, mainstream ERP enterprise technology vendors. So, companies like SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, they're actively looking at ways to leverage artificial intelligence, machine learning to enable better optimized business processes, to enable predictive analytics, or enable future types of capabilities or things that might be happening in the future. That whole machine learning and AI concept is just now starting to break into the mainstream. And just to give you an example, or maybe a use case of where sort of a micro process where you're starting to see it is, some vendors are starting to work AI and machine learning into commodity processes and redundant processes, like, for example, accounts payable processing. So for processing invoices, and we had a human that was manually looking at every single invoice that came in and approving it or not, or rejecting it. Now you have machine learning processes and capabilities that can automate that, to where the human now focuses on exceptions. So anything that falls outside certain thresholds, or doesn't match up against historic trends, or there's statistical anomalies in the data of what's being processed, the humans become focused on those exceptions. So that's just one sort of micro process or example of where machine learning and AI is starting to get built into technology better than it was in the past. Now, the thing here, though, is it's still, again, two things to think about. One is it's not fully permeated into enterprise technology in general. There's certainly plenty of money being spent on machine learning development capabilities and artificial intelligence, but it's still, as I mentioned, not quite fully integrated into enterprise technologies, the more common enterprise technologies. So that's one thing. It's still very much a work in progress. The other thing to think about too is the impact that machine learning and AI has on an organization is very dramatic, or it can be very dramatic if you fully take advantage of it. So when you think about things like the example I gave, where we're going to automate our invoice processing and our AP processes, and we're going to have humans focus on exceptions rather than having humans manually process every single invoice. That's a huge change for most organizations. And it's a lot easier said than done to say that we're going to save X percent of time or X dollars per year on processing invoices. The potential's there, but actually getting there is a lot more painful than organizations realize or plan for. And so they stick a number in their business case. Hopefully they've done a business case and they stick a number in it. But then actually getting there and realizing those benefits is a whole nother story. So it's really important to make sure that you have a realistic view of how we're going to get there. What's our transition plan? And again, back to change management. This stuff, machine learning, AI, isn't going to matter if we don't have really strong change management to go along with it. And I'd say that the sexier and the more sophisticated that technology becomes and the faster technology changes, the more important organizational change management is. We've got to, so it's almost like adding a anecdote to the technological change that can be threatening and disruptive to organizations. We need to add even more change management on the human side to make sure that we bring the two together to integrate the two. So machine learning, AI, really exciting trend. I think it's super cool what's happening here, but it's also, again, very disruptive. Most people say disruption in a good way, like it's disruption and it's going to be a game changer. But we also have to look at it in the short term. What is that going to do to our organization? How do we manage that? How do we navigate it? What do we do with those people that, their jobs are being automated, or suddenly they don't have as much work to do? Are we getting rid of people? Are we reassigning them? Are we reskilling them or upskilling them to do something different? All that stuff we have to think carefully through to get the full benefit of these and other types of technologies. Another hot commodity or thing that's becoming more and more important, but it's not necessarily a technology per se, is risk mitigation. Along with the rapid pace of change and the disruption and the impact to organizations comes an elevated level of risk. And again, this is another point that software vendors oftentimes don't want to mention, or they may not want to call out because it could be considered a weakness. But the reality is that these sorts of transformations are becoming riskier. The opportunities are greater, the benefits are greater than they've ever been, but the path to get there and that gap between current state and future state is much larger than it's ever been. And so organizations need to be real careful about how they manage risk. And again, it's a matter of making sure you've got a clear and realistic roadmap and expectations for how we're going to achieve the business benefits that we're expecting to see, and also how are we going to identify and mitigate risks along the way. I'll give you an example of one common example is that when organizations decide they're going to start an ERP implementation, of enterprise-wide technology initiative, a lot of times they go through this strenuous evaluation process. They decide on the technology. Momentum's really high. People are excited and they're ready to just jump in and start doing stuff. They sign the contract. They have access to the software. System integrator and vendor are pressuring them to get started right away because it's in their best interest for you to start right away, so they can start billing for the subscription costs as well as billing you for the system integrator time. But the reality is that's a real dangerous path to go down. You end up what we could oftentimes I'll often refer to as cliff diving. We're just jumping into the abyss without a clear vision of what we want to be when we grow up or how we're going to manage this project. System integrator comes in and steamrolls us, and we end up spending way too much time and money on an initiative that we didn't need to spend that much time and money. So that's just a real simple, common example of how risk mitigation and proper planning can help reduce your costs, reduce your risk. But then again, getting back to that point of that massive jump that we're making in a lot of our transformations with these new technologies and that sort of thing, risk is higher than ever. So how do we mitigate the risks and identify those along the way? That's a key thing that's going to be a big differentiator between successful organizations and organizations that fail in their initiatives going forward. And then similarly, flexibility is going to become a competitive advantage. That tends to be an area that organizations struggle with now with their old legacy systems. And a lot of clients that call us say, hey, we need help getting off our old system because we just aren't flexible enough. We can't adapt fast enough with the system we have in place that we've had for 20 or 30 years. So let's find some technology that's going to help us be more flexible. And again, if our goal is to be flexible, and flexibility is an important part of your organizational strategy and in your future and your path forward. Then you want to make sure that you are building a strategy and roadmap and plan that is focused on that. So, for example, if you're evaluating potential ERP systems out there and you go with a large standard ERP system like an SAP S/4HANA, for example, relatively speaking, that's a relatively inflexible system when you compare it to other systems like Oracle or maybe Microsoft Dynamics. It's just not as flexible. It provides you more common business processes potentially, and potentially more scale and efficiency, but it doesn't provide you flexibility as much as potentially other solutions out there. So that's the sort of thing, not just in your software evaluation, that you need to be thinking about it, just in terms of our overall roadmap, or how do we embed maximum flexibility within our organization if that's important to us, and how do we ensure that we have the right technologies, the right strategies, the right roadmap, the right change management approach, all that good stuff to make sure that we're being effective in achieving that and accomplishing that goal. Now, the other part of this that I think is very important to mention, and again, it's not related to technology, but it is an important trend, is that the human side of change isn't going to change. And what I mean by that is change management is still important. We as humans don't like to change, despite, no matter how open-minded we think we are. The reality is we don't like to change, and we certainly don't like to change as fast as technology is changing. And the pace of change with technology is only accelerating. So this is becoming more of a phenomena over time. And so the fact that the human side of change won't change is good news, bad news. The bad news is that it's still going to be very important, and the technology is going to make it more important and more risky from a human perspective. But the good news is that the things you should be doing from a change management perspective hasn't really changed a lot. I mean, if you're doing it right, the change management stuff you were doing 5 or 10 years ago, if it was done effectively, it's still going to apply now and in the future. So that's the good news, is that the change management piece of it is constantly an important factor. Now, the other problem here is that most organizations never handled change management well in the first place. And so the fact that now technology is changing faster and change management is becoming even more important to organizations going forward is a pretty significant risk. So for those of you that are in the change management space and are good at change management, there's a lot of opportunity in the market. And this is going to be a very in-demand need, I would suspect, in the coming years, as organizations start to feel the pain of technological change and the level of disruption that it brings to their organizations. So the human side of change isn't really changing, despite all the other changes in the industry and with technology. So the key question to ask yourself as we think about our long-term roadmap to 2025 and beyond is, how are we going to address that human side of change? How are we going to navigate it? How are we going to treat organizational change and the human side of the component equal or greater than technology? Too often organizations spend way too much time and money on the technological piece. And again, you have to think about dynamics here and the human behavior. There's two things at play in terms of why we spend so much time and money on technology and so little time and money on the human side. One is that it's a lot easier to see and touch and feel when the technology doesn't work. So we end up gravitating to the thing that we can see and touch and feel. We can see it when it's broken. We know it's broken. We can test it, and either it works or it doesn't. When it comes to the human side of organizational change management, it's not as cut and dry. It's harder to see and touch and feel. It's more of an art than a science. And that makes it more difficult for people within an organization to see the importance of it and to understand what's happening and what needs to be done to navigate the change. And then the other dynamic that I think creating is this unevenly distributed focus on too much technology and not enough human side of change is the fact that you have software vendors and system integrators in the marketplace that are very focused on technology, and they're pushing very hard on the technology work stream or the technology piece of transformation. So that ends up being where so many people's time and attention ends up going for that reason as well. So really making sure we have a clear vision for organizational change management strategy is going to be critical. And that's going to be definitely a critical success factor for organizations going forward. So that takes us to the end of my presentation here. And again, the intent here is to provide a quick flyover view of what are some of those challenges and things that we should be aware of. and certain trends that we see happening in the marketplace at a high level. Again, we're going to dive into a lot of the stuff that I just glossed over here now. We're going to dive into in sessions throughout the day and throughout the week as well. The one that's probably most relevant to this discussion, or a most relevant follow-on or part two, will be Stuart's session here in a little over an hour. So that being said, I guess I'll open it to any questions that the audience might have, and then we'll take a quick break and then come back with our next speaker. But what questions do you have, or Kyler, have any questions come through that I didn't see? I wasn't fully paying attention the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. So Enrique, who's joining us from Chile, has a question about working with global teams and how that might impact your overall project. So he had given some specific examples, obviously South Africa, US. How do you kind of make sure that you're implementing the best practices when you're working on global transformations? I know you know a lot about that, and so do other professionals at Third Stage. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I'll say that I believe it's tomorrow. Adam Cheatham is doing a session on global transformations. And correct me if I'm wrong. Is it tomorrow, Kyler, that he has that session?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. So he's going to dive more into that. I'll spend a full session just on global transformations. But the thing I'll add, maybe just as a sort of a preview or a high level introduction, would be, I mean, first of all, you want to have, if I have to sort of check off the things that come to mind that are most important for a global transformation, one would be to have a cross geographical core team, people from all different parts in different countries that not only understand the culture locally and how, the culture is different from other parts of the organization, but also how the operations are different. And also just understanding how some of the nuances and differences between their part of the organization. And then also you want people that are not only cross geographical, that understand the current state, amongst all the different areas of the world, but also people that have a vision or can help formulate a vision for what it could be going forward. So that's the first thing, is having that core team. Second thing would be to really take a close look at and have a clear vision and strategy for what is it you want the organization to be globally. Are you trying to migrate? And I'll give you two extreme examples. It's usually not either one of these. It's usually somewhere on a continuum in between. But are you looking for this project to drive a sort of standardization and a common operating model across the entire organization? Are you looking for independently operated parts of the world where each region or each office acts as their own entity, in essence? Or is there some hybrid in between? And usually it's a hybrid in between, and usually it's different based on what business process you're talking about or what function or capability within the organization you're talking about. For example, you might decide that we're going to centralize and consolidate and standardize finance, but our sales and customer service, we're going to keep that fairly flexible. We're going to keep that decentralized. We're going to let the regions or the different country offices handle their own sales and customer services processes. So those are the types of decisions that, again, you want to make those decisions early in the project before you ever start bringing in system integrators, before you ever even pick your software solution. Those are the types of answers that you want to define, and you want to make sure that you carefully weigh the pros and the cons of that. And then the other thing I would say, I guess, if I had to think of a third thing that is worth noting with global transformations, is just making sure you have a clear rollout transition strategy. And usually for global organizations, it's typically a multi-year process if you're a mid-sized, a larger organization. And you just want to have a clear roadmap for how that transition is going to happen, and where what the sequence of rollouts are going to be, and what the risks and the trade-offs are of that. So those are some of the things that come to mind. And again, Adam's session will dive more into that in particular.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. And then we have just a few more. So we'll do, how about two more and then take a quick break before we go into Marcus. So Dave asked, what will the number one challenge be for organizations in 2025? It's a big one.
Wow, that's a great question. And I just froze up. Did you notice that? It wasn't me freezing up trying to think. It was totally a tech issue there.
Sure.
No, but the biggest thing to be aware of, I guess it would just be, if I had to predict, I'd say I think there's going to be in about 4 years from now, if we're talking 2025, I think that's probably about the time where you start to see the tension build between technology and human side of the equation. I think technology is changing so much in a way that, again, is very opportunistic and has a lot of upside potential for organizations and businesses, but it's super disruptive to people, as I mentioned. And I think that I call it a divergence, even though it's not intended to be that, but it's sort of a strain that's building between, the threat of eliminating jobs and the threat of completely disrupting people's skills and what they were trained to do. I think that's going to reach a tipping point or a boiling point, and that again comes back to change management, where I think change management is going to become even more important by 2025 just because of that. So I think that tension building and bubbling under the surface, again, if you just think about machine learning and artificial intelligence, that's probably the best example. Or robotics. I know manufacturers have dealt with robotics now for a long time, so it's nothing new to a lot of manufacturers. But you think about robotic process automation and some of the other uses of robotic type technology, and again, the end result, whether you like it or not, or whether it's the intent or not, is that you're displacing humans. And so, with that acceleration of technology and trends in that direction, along with the humans' inability to change as fast as technology, I think you're gonna see more of a tipping point there with change management.
Excellent. Thank you. And I know we have a lot of Q&A regarding OCM. So I just want to remind everyone that our director, Nate, will actually go through that later today. So be sure to check out that session. I also just want to remind everyone that we are garnering all of your questions for the music Q&A tonight. So just in case we don't get to you, we definitely see them there. The last one I think we'll go through today, Eric. Maritza had a question regarding digital transformation for a construction company. And I think it's a good one because she covers field service versus head office. So making sure that those systems work together. And she's wondering if that's possible. So can you just kind of touch on, if you are in the field service or have a distribution leg of your business, what that looks like in the ERP lens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's two paths you can take there, and we work a lot with a lot of utility and construction type companies, so energy utilities, construction, a lot of organizations like that have that need for field services. And there's two different paths you can take. You have your sort of traditional ERP route, where you start with your back office functions like finance, accounting, inventory management, and then you figure out how could we extend that to field service. And not every ERP system out there handles field services well, and some just don't handle it at all. There are some systems like, for example, IFS is a mid-market ERP system that has strong field service capabilities. So there are ERP systems like that, and others like IFS and others out there where yes, it has the core back office ERP systems, but it's also or the core back office ERP functions, but it also has strong field service capabilities. Now, with ERP systems in general, you always have that decision or trade-off you have to make. Is it more important for us to have one system that isn't going to meet everyone's needs by definition? Or do we want more of a best of breed approach, where we can find the best back office system and then go out and find the best field service solution that could then integrate with the back office system? And there are field services options out there, systems that are more focused on field services from a best of breed perspective, that you could then integrate back to your ERP system. And so I think you could go either way, but I think it's a lot of times comes down to, what are the priorities of the organization? If field services is a critical part of what this transformation is going to mean to you and your organization, maybe that becomes your top priority, is to evaluate options from a field service first perspective, and then maybe you can accept whatever you can get with accounting and finance, for example. But other organizations have a CFO driving a transformation, and they might do the opposite and say finance is the most important thing. Whatever we can get out of field services is fine. So I think that's part of the question you have to ask, not just for field services versus back office, but for any function. I mean, if you're in sales, or if you're in a warehouse and you're thinking about warehouse management, those are all examples of the types of trade-offs you may need to think about and really prioritize accordingly. So we see a lot of organizations that'll, have like a field service group or we see this a lot with sales organizations where they just sort of go off on their own and just find the technology that's going to meet their needs best. And then they work with IT to figure out how to tie it back together. But if it's part of a broader transformation where you're looking at all your systems across the entire enterprise, that's where you want to weigh the pros and cons of both paths there.